Hello everyone, thanks for being here, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to you this afternoon Professor Christopher White, who's here as part of the Martin Marley series on American religions, and his title, as you will see, is Higher Dimensions, Fantastic Science and the Modern Religious Imagination. So let me just introduce to you Professor White, who received his PhD in religious studies from Harvard University, where he studied religion and culture in modern Europe and America. He is particularly interested in religion and science, spirituality and unchurched religion, new religious movements, electronic media, and popular culture. He's published articles on these and other subjects in scholarly journals and edited books, including articles in Religion and American Culture and the American Historical Review. His first book, Unsettled Minds, Psychology and the American Search for Spiritual Assurance, that came out with the University of California Press in 2009, examined how modern Europeans and Americans use psychological and medical insights to fashion new, more scientific ways of testing, analyzing, and sometimes even fostering religious trances, visions, and experiences. His second book, Other Worlds, Spirituality and a Search for Invisible Dimensions, Harvard University Press 2018, examines the cultural history of the idea that the universe has hidden dimensions, spaces, and worlds, something William James also would have liked. So I'm very happy that Professor White has been able to come in despite the weather, and very much look forward to his talk on higher dimensions, fantastic science, and the modern religious imagination. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Should I lift this up? Okay. All right. Thanks for that nice introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me to campus. I'm going to talk about my book project and then some of the work I'm trying to do now out of the book project. In the book, I looked at the idea that the universe has invisible spaces or realms, sometimes called parallel universes, and the imaginative work that those ideas did for people. For writers, for television producers, for film producers, for sci-fi writers. A lot of people I think that you would know actually are in my research and in the book. People like C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Madeleine L'Engle, shows like Twilight Zone, films like Interstellar. So the book really looks at the last 100 years of what I call here fantastic science. And I'm trying to think about the ways that people fashion new religious subjectivities, and I'm turning in some ways away from institutional religion and thinking instead about other sources of enchanted worldviews, and looking in particular at things like science fiction as a source of, let's say, belief in the supernatural, or as a way of thinking about supernatural. I'm also looking at fantastic science, which is, in this case, it's a lot of cosmologists and physicists who write popular science, who write in that genre of popular science. And there's a way in which, when you pick up a book in popular science, right, like Brian Greene at Columbia, who writes all these sort of fantastic books about cosmology and the multiverse, there's a way in which those books sort of build up excitement, right? That's in part what they do. They build up excitement about these kind of fantastic scientific ideas. Right, and those include things like an infinite universe. Those include things like the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, right? They include things like quantum entanglement, or quantum non-locality, right? Or dark matter. Or in this case, they include this idea that there might be invisible spaces to reality, or invisible dimensions to reality. So this is really the one fantastic idea I take up in the book, and I used to think about the religious imagination with. So I got my start in thinking about this by looking at some data. I teach at Vassar College, and I teach I teach religion in America, religion in modern America, modern Europe, and for those of you who work in those areas or have seen, or been on the Pew Foundation or the Pew Forum website, you've seen these numbers, right? You've seen numbers about sort of declining participation and institutional religion, and you've seen a corresponding rise, actually, in the number of people who call themselves things like spiritual but not religious, right? So it's really, these numbers have really been remarkable, right? And they started in 1990. It was sort of, for the first time in the history of American polling, there was a decline in the number of Americans who self-identified as Christians. Right? That number had always been, since polling began, it had always been about 85%, 86%, something like this. Starting in 1990, that number started to go down. The number of Americans who self-identify as Christian. 85, 84, 83. At first sociologists thought this was a fluke, but they kept doing the studies, and that number has continued to go down. Now it's about 69% of Americans self-identify as Christian. This is from an American political scientist named Tobin Grant, who has put together data from 400 different studies about religious participation. So this is sort of his very unsubtle graph about what's happening, right? He calls it, there it is right there, the great decline. Sometimes I show these things to my students. I say, what do you think? What's happening? And they say, well, I think something's going down. This one's pretty easy to see. So this is his take on, like I said, he pulls together like data on participation in traditional religion. So I mean, like, how many times do you pray a week? Do you go to worship services? Do you belong to a congregation? Right, so he's taken a number of these data, and he's plotted it here. So this is a story that's not just in Tobin Grant's data, but it's really all over the place, and you can look at a number of different sources. As I said a second ago, though, there still is a very robust belief in the supernatural in America. Right? You still see a very strong belief across the board in America, belief in God, belief in angels, belief in a heavenly afterlife. Those numbers are still very high, right? Even though, as I've said, the numbers of religiously unaffiliated have gone up. So this is sort of the corresponding number. And then you have other surveys that ask people, do they consider themselves religious or spiritual? And then you have this religious, I'm religious, but I'm spiritual but not religious, right? You've seen those numbers go up as well. Quite remarkable, a full third of the American population now says that I'm spiritual but not religious. So my project sort of began with this, which seemed to me kind of counterintuitive, or at least a kind of a puzzle. How is it that in the absence of traditional religion and traditional religious practices, Americans still are sustaining at really high levels these kind of beliefs in the fantastic, in the supernatural, and things like heavenly afterlife, or ghosts, or demons, or so on, right? And this is where I turn to popular science, right, and what I'm calling here fantastic scientific ideas. So the one idea I focused on is this idea that there are higher spatial dimensions to reality. This sounds very esoteric, okay? But I'm going to explain it, and I'm hoping that we'll all get it. It's actually, once you have it explained, it kind of makes sense, I hope, right? I don't know, if you really pay close attention, maybe some of you will be able to see into higher dimensions today. Some of the people I write about said that they could see into higher dimensions. There's a connection with William James, actually. He corresponded with one of the main figures who writes about higher dimensions in my book. So dimensions. So what is a higher dimension, all right? So here, this is a line. A line has one dimension. It has length. All right, it has one direction or one dimension. It has length. And then if you take every point in that line and you stretch it in a new direction, that's perpendicular to the line, right, you'd stretch that down into a two-dimensional square, flat square, right, that has length and it has width. Right, so those are the two directions, or two dimensions there. All right, then to make it into a three-dimensional object, you take every point in that square and you stretch it in another direction. Right, that would be perpendicular. The other two, what direction would that be? I always call them the people sitting in the front. So that's what I tell my students: if you're going to sit in the front, what direction would that be? A third direction, perpendicular to the other two, in order to stretch this two-dimensional square into a third direction, third dimension. Out. So it would be stretching it this way or that way through the screen. Okay, so you end up with like a Rubik's Cube, right? That's a three-dimensional object. That has three spatial dimensions. It has, length, width, and height. Everything in our world apparently has these three spatial dimensions or directions, all right? So here's the tricky part, though. Okay, so you really have to think about this. So if you take every point in the cube, right, every point on the surface of the cube, every point on the inside of the cube, and you stretch all those points in a fourth direction, all right, that's perpendicular to the other three directions. What direction is that? Some of you are shaking your heads, yes. Well, yeah, we don't know, right? So there could be such a direction to reality, but it's not a direction that we could perceive, right? But that would be a fourth dimension. All right, this is an imperceptible dimension to us. Either there's only three spatial dimensions to reality, or we're only equipped to perceive three spatial dimensions, and there might be others. Okay, those are possibilities. This is how someone has represented the stretching of a three-dimensional cube into a fourth-dimensional cube. Sometimes this is called a hypercube or a tesseract. Maybe some of you have heard that word tesseract or tesser. You ever heard that before? Yes, metalingual, that's right. And other sci-fi, right? So the term tesseract was coined by a person I talk about in some of the research that I've done, some of the writing I've done, Charles Hinton, who was sort of a Victorian-era British mathematician and social reformer. But he got very into this idea that there could be a fourth direction, and he developed a whole visualization technique. And he actually met with William James, and he gave William James this whole. He basically had a Rubik's Cube set that was labeled. All the faces, edges, and sides of this Rubik's Cube were labeled. It was a set of 27 cubes that you stacked up, and everything was you're supposed to memorize everything and rotate it in your mind. And James was like, I can't do this. He was actually sympathetic to Hinton, and James was sympathetic that there might be an invisible direction or space to reality. But he couldn't deal with Hinton's techniques. Hinton actually felt that he could see into a fourth space. Most people at the time and now say that, oh no, maybe it exists, we don't know, but that's not something that we could perceive. One question is, where would that space be? What would that direction be? Right? And I sort of asked you that question. I was like, well, where would that direction be? One answer that some people give in some of the stories that I tell is that it goes into the inner self somehow, and it's a direction in consciousness. And you see this coming up with James, actually. James actually was one person who, when he corresponded with Hinton, wrote about the ways that maybe there's a department of the mind or something that has an extension into this fourth direction. And James is not the only one. There's a whole history from James into the psychedelic movement where folks are using this idea to sort of buttress their belief in kind of a spiritual dimension to reality. So there are higher dimensional objects that geometers and mathematicians think about today. Again, we don't know if these objects have any basis in reality, but this is actually from a Wikipedia page on higher dimensional objects. So we know what the properties of like a higher dimensional cube would be. We know what the properties of a tesseract would be. All right, and you can see this is a regular cube here. All right, it has 12 edges, 6 faces. Right, you can think of like a cardboard box, right? It's a cube. It has 6 faces on it. Right? So we know the properties of a cube. But then you go to a tesseract or a hypercube, and we know the properties here too, right? And the interesting thing about a tesseract is that it is bounded by 8 cubes. So it's a hard object to imagine. You can actually Google tesseract or hypercube, and you can look online at computer-generated models that geometers create. So the boundary condition of a tesseract or a hypercube is 8 cubes. All right, and then this goes on for a fifth dimension, 6th dimension, and so on. This was someone's representation. This was actually a theosophical writer who was writing in the early 20th century, Claude Dragon, also an architect in New York, who actually creates sort of a built environment of higher dimensional objects because he believes that you can actually train the self to see into these higher spaces somehow. And so he has a number of different ways of representing this. This is actually a cut down version of a hypercube. So you can imagine a cardboard box, which is a regular cube. Maybe you remember from being a kid, right? If you take that cardboard box and you cut it down and you flatten it down into flat two-dimensional space, what does it look like?
A T.
Yeah, like a T or like a cross, right? And it's the same way with a hypercube or a tesseract, which has those 8 cubes as its boundary. If you cut it down and spread it in three-dimensional space, you get an object like this. These are the 8 cubes that were the boundary condition of it. 1, 2, 3 in the inside, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those are the 8 cubes. So that's kind of a cut-down version of it. I showed you that because Salvador Dali created a painting of the crucified Christ on a hypercube that looks like that. I'm going to show that a little bit later. Okay, so there's a lot of different uses of this idea. There's a lot of imaginative uses of the idea that the universe might have additional spatial dimensions. This is it's in science fiction literature, it's in fantasy literature. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the uses of this idea in pop culture. Right? As I say here, higher dimensional space is a familiar trope. It's often a place where angels come from, or demons come from, or aliens. Right? Sometimes it's sometimes it's kind of a heavenly space. It has a number of different ways that it's used. This is an Iron Man. Well, I love this. This is his diary in Iron Man, right? Maybe some of you have seen like the Iron Man series. This is a tesseract, right? And he's doing what we just did, like with these objects. He's like thinking about what higher dimension spaces would be like, and he's kind of writing about it here. And this is another representation of a tesseract or a hypercube. There are 8 cubes in here, but it's all squished and distorted because we're looking at it from our 3-dimensional space. I feel like at some point I'm going to trip on this, but
since you operate in more than 3 dimensions, you won't be hurt. Yeah.
I'm going to transcend it. Thank you. That's right. I am going to. Yes, I'm going to try to transcend. Try to transcend this. So you see it in Marvel comics. You see it in a lot of films nowadays. You see it in Doctor Who, right? Here you go. There are other kinds of cosmic cubes actually that are sort of these portals or openings to other dimensions and other spaces. Sometimes they have these astonishing powers. Sometimes they fall in the hands of the bad guys. There was also this great scene that I do write about in an article or two about the film Interstellar. Anyone seen the film Interstellar? No, nobody? Curtis, not even you? All right. Well, it's good. It's a good film. It sort of follows the narrative of Madeline L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time in some ways. It's about a daughter who loses her dad. Her dad is Matthew McConaughey. He's an astronaut. He goes on this mission. Long story short, I think this can be like a spoiler, I guess, but you should still see it. It's interesting. But so they get super close to a black hole. They're traveling in outer space. They get super close to a black hole, which is kind of sucking in their ship, and he actually jettisons his part of the ship to save his partner, Anne Hathaway. She's able to break away, but he goes down into the black hole, and then he falls into a tesseract. He even calls it a tesseract, and he's in this tesseract space, and he's able to see into all other times and spaces in reality. And he's able to look back actually from behind the bookshelf in his daughter's room and see the moment when she was little, when he went in there and told her that he was going to have to go on this mission to space. And he pounds on the back of the bookshelf to try to get his own attention, right? His past self's attention, to tell him not to do what he's about to do, which is go on this mission. And a few books fall off the shelf, and they actually happen to be these sort of higher dimensional kinds of narratives. In the rest of the film, the daughter grows up, she becomes a mathematician, and she figures out what happens to her dad. So now I've spoiled it. I've spoiled it for all of you. But it is quite good. All right. So then there's a whole category of ways in which higher dimensions are used by religious folks, or maybe I should say spiritual folks. And in my articles and in my book, it's often folks who have sort of fallen away from religion and are sort of not sure about religion, right? And these include Salvador Dali, who was raised Catholic but sort of went away from that. And then Dali was very interested actually in science. He was very interested in math and in physics and in psychoanalysis in particular. And Dali, he cultivated a friendship with Tom Banshoff, who's a geometer at Brown University, who's probably the most famous geometer who deals with higher dimensional objects. And so he met, every summer Dali would come and like hold court at this hotel in New York, and he would invite Tom Banshoff to come, and they would talk science and they would talk math. And so he absorbs a lot of these ideas, and Dali sort of borrows them to develop what I'm thinking of as sort of a new, more scientific way of thinking about the supernatural, right? And I see that in a lot of the people who are sort of borrowing from these fantastic concepts, a new way to talk in more scientific language about the supernatural. And you can see here is Christ suspended on an unfolded hypercube, right? That is that tesseract that's unfolded in three-dimensional space, so it looks like that cross, and that you have those 8 cubes, which were the boundary condition of the hypercube. So Dali works through this in a number of ways, and then many others do as well. So the American evangelical Billy Graham has at the 1964 World Fair, he has a whole pavilion called Man in the Fifth Dimension. Okay, he's calling it fifth dimension here, and Madeline Engel also calls it fifth dimension instead of fourth spatial dimension, because Einstein, who became sort of world famous in 1919, talked about space-time being four-dimensional, with the fourth dimension being time. Okay, so Einstein talked about the fabric of space-time being 3 spatial dimensions and 1 additional temporal dimension. But what these people are trying to get at actually is another space, right? Another dimension. So then the language shifts a little bit to fifth dimension after the 1920s. And Billy Graham is using this category, again, as kind of a stand-in category for spirit, as maybe a more scientific way of talking about spirit. And this goes right on up to today. Right, with a number of hippie physicists. I don't know if you know this great book, How the Hippies Saved Physics. it's really good. David Kaiser, who's a historian of science at MIT. So it's basically about like a generation of physicists who get their PhDs and get their degrees in the 60s, but find that they really want to do more speculation about some of the uncanny aspects of physics, some of the what I'm calling the fantastic aspects of physics, right? How can things separated by miles, by tens of thousands of miles, by millions of miles, how can 2 things be entangled such that when you do something to one thing that's entangled, the other thing, no matter how far away, instantly shows a change, right? How can we explain that fantastic idea? Or how can we explain the idea of the many worlds interpretation, which is about sort of the parallel worlds that might exist in reality? Or how can we explain other things, right, like higher dimensions? So Wolf and Elizabeth Rauscher and a number of people actually at UC Berkeley, he got his PhD at UCLA in physics, but a number of them sort of dropped out, basically, and started writing philosophy and teaching about spirituality. You know, they did that thing where they went to India and they lived in an ashram for a while, and they did that kind of thing too. And some of them did, drugs, and some of them, did meditation. And so there's a variety of things happen. But you can Google this guy, and he's a pretty well-known writer today in sort of the American spiritual but not religious landscape. So, and he goes by this, he has this kind of alter ego, Dr. Quantum, and so you can watch his YouTube videos of Dr. Quantum flying in other dimensions and things like this, right? So sometimes when I give talks about this material, people raise their hands, right, and say, well, how do we think about this kind of appropriation of scientific concepts? So let me just address that. I can anticipate your question. But how do we think about the religious or spiritual appropriation of scientific concepts, right? Is this legitimate, right? Can someone take a fantastic scientific concept, like a higher spatial dimension, for instance, which scientists don't know if it exists, right? And then can they use it to buttress spiritual or supernatural beliefs, right? And this is a conversation that I try to narrate in my work, push back from secular science, and then push back from religious people who borrow these ideas. So I would say that this kind of dynamic does animate my work, right? This contestation over who controls scientific ideas and who can discuss their meaning. All right, so I actually wanted to read a little bit on this. Most scientists who talk about higher dimensions talk about them as imperceptible spaces, but nevertheless physical spaces that are part of the natural world. All right? They're inclined to emphasize this when they're confronted with New Age believers like Dr. Quantum, or like Shirley MacLaine, right? Or like Deepak Chopra. Maybe you've heard of Deepak Chopra, but Deepak Chopra talks a lot about these kind of fantastic scientific. He has like books like Quantum This and Quantum That, Quantum Healing, right? And so on. And he also talks about these kinds of higher dimensions. And many scientists will push back and say, like, look, we're talking about variables within the context of linear algebraic equations. We're not talking about a new heaven and a new earth, right? So how do I see what's happening here? I think a couple things are happening. First of all, scientists argue, when they push back, that science excludes metaphysical speculation. And that's not something that we should do as scientists. Now, I think that is problematic and tricky, right? When they try to rule out speculation and metaphysics. And there are conversations among physicists themselves about this issue, right? What kinds of things are included in science? For instance, should like a kind of a mathematical formalism, right, which you have in theoretical physics, should that be included under the umbrella of science, right? When there's absolutely no proof for these, for instance, string theory, right, which is a set of mathematical theories that tries to do something important and something necessary, right, which is to harmonize the two sets of laws that we have for the universe. Right now we have two sets of laws for the universe. Maybe you didn't know that. and we know that they're correct, but we know that they don't actually go together. They don't fit together. We have quantum mechanics for the world of the very small, and we have general relativity and Einstein's relativism, or relativistic formulas for the world of the very large. We know that both are true, but they don't actually fit together. That's where string theorists come in and say that, okay, we need to develop a mathematical model actually that will fit all of it together. The only way to do it is to get more space in the mathematics and include higher dimensional spaces, right? And string theory and brain theory and M theory, they have 10 extra dimensions, 12 extra dimensions, including extra temporal dimensions. Don't ask me about extra temporal dimensions. I have no idea how to explain what an extra time is. I think I have the extra space thing, but I have no idea about extra time. So how do we think about what science is? Is that science? Again, sometimes some scientists say this is not science. I think the rejoinder to that would be that, well, a lot of mathematical equations led the way to real discoveries. For instance, Einstein's theories of general relativity, right? This was a mathematical formula. There was no proof for it until 1919 when someone found proof for it. So someone more theoretically inclined or inclined towards the mathematical side might say, look, mathematics, it is unempirical, but it does actually reveal real truths about the world that can be discovered later. And that's the same defense that some string theorists will make. So when people try to put boundaries around science and say that it shouldn't be speculative, it shouldn't be unempirical, there's going to be some pushback there. So that's one issue. Another issue is that I would say that scientists are often, like the rest of us, inconsistent. Especially when you read in the genre of popular science, right? Some of you may have watched science documentaries. Some of you may have read, in the genre of popular science. What's happening there? That's a genre of science writing where scientists are trying to build excitement. They're trying to build buy-in, right, from their readers. And you find all kinds of fantastic stuff. For instance, in a very sober scientist like Brian Greene, who's at Columbia. In part, like I said, to convince people that this is important, to convince people that this is exciting, and maybe I could use the word, sublime or wonderful or awesome. I think Brian Greene has that sensibility. So I think in the genre of popular science, that's happening. Historians who write about popular science often talk about popular science as the genre where the meaning of science gets negotiated. And I think you see that in the popular science as well. So, here in this realm and in other kinds of popular science, the meaning of science gets negotiated. What does it mean to talk about a mathematics of invisible spaces? What is the impact of this way of thinking? I think that scientists do push back on this kind of thinking, and I think they would be dismayed to see the kinds of things that I'm showing you with all these folks in pop cultures appropriating this idea. But I think that as someone who's interested in culture and how culture works and how it changes over time, I think the reality of it is that physics in the 20th century has become fantastic. And I think that some people look at that and they say, you know what? If physicists have these fantastic models of these, wild ideas like higher dimensional spaces or parallel worlds, why can't I believe in a spiritual heaven? So there's a way in which, and again, I don't think scientists like that, but I think that there's a way in which these kinds of fantastic scientific ideas do for people build kind of a sense of plausibility, right? They create a structure of plausibility around it. And so I think that that's kind of in play. Okay, so let me talk about Madeline L'Engle briefly and W.B. Du Bois. How much time do we have? I haven't been watching the time. Is someone else watching the time?
We have another half hour.
Oh,
Yeah, we started it a while.
I won't even use a half hour. Okay, so writers, activists, religious people, televangelists, have used this idea of higher dimensions not just to revive kind of their own supernatural beliefs, which is definitely part of the story I try to tell, but they've also used these ideas to get leverage against dominant ideologies and sort of to power social reform in various ways. And my first example on that is Madeline L'Engle, who uses this idea of higher dimensions in a number of ways. And then my second example will be W.B. Du Bois, who also uses the idea in a really kind of obscure, unpublished short story that he wrote. Okay, so Madeline L'Engle, I'm sure many of you know the story about Madeline L'Engle. She was a New Yorker. She was raised in an Episcopal church. She ends up kind of falling away from church. She finds church too dogmatic, too rigid, too misogynist. And by her 20s, she goes to Smith College. By her 20s, she moves away from the church. Then she gets married. She moves to Connecticut. They have a couple of kids, and she starts thinking about, I guess we would call it supernatural or spiritual questions again. She finds she's not sure if she can really go back to church. Actually, her pastor asked her if she could teach Sunday school, and she said, well, I don't believe in God, right? And he said, that's okay. This was an Episcopal church in the 60s, right? He said, well, that's okay. You don't have to believe in God. And she said, okay. So she starts doing that. She can't get into theology, but what does she do? She starts to read popular science. Okay, so she starts to read some popularizations of sort of Einstein's theories of special and general relativity. She starts to read sort of popularizations of math and quantum mechanics, and even ideas about there being higher spatial dimensions. And she has a kind of an awakening in some ways. And I guess we can call her spiritual. I mean, she kind of acquires, or reacquires these sort of enchanted views. And she works this all out by sitting down and writing. She writes A Wrinkle in Time. This is sort of her first book. She says that she sat down to write this in order to figure out what she believed and what she could believe. All right, and she writes this narrative. She sends it to a bunch of publishers. Nobody wants to publish it. Right? This is a great story for us academics, right? Who publish these books, who go from one press to another press, and then publish books and struggle. So she really struggled, right? And she kind of really got depressed and really wrestled with it. And she finally found a publisher who took it. And it's an interesting book. How many of you read the book? Okay, yeah, it's still pretty widely read. It strikes us today, I think, as very overtly religious, right? She's kind of going back and she's quoting like the Bible, but it's not orthodox at all, right? Which I think is one reason people didn't want to touch it, because she quotes the the Bible, but then she quotes like Einstein and Shakespeare and the Buddha, and it's kind of a little bit of and other scientists, right? So a little bit of everything. It's her kind of working out her views, and she mobilizes these ideas about higher dimensions in the book, right? She talks about tessering, right? And she talks about the tesseract and tessering, which is for her sort of an opening to other dimensions in space. Again, she calls it kind of a fifth dimension at this point, to think of the idea of a beyond kind of space, right? Now, the other thing she does in the book, and this is where I want to get into Madeleine L'Engle as a kind of a reformer, is one reason she gets away from tradition is because she feels like women are maligned and stereotyped and one-dimensional in most of science fiction and fantasy up until the 1960s, which is really true. I mean, if you read comic books, if you read science fiction in the first half of the 20th century, it really is a literature that's by and for boys. I mean, women are sexualized and they're one-dimensional and they're sort of like, they're there to just sort of like praise the male protagonist. So she writes a very different narrative, though, right? She kind of borrows these ideas about higher dimensions and develops kind of a female protagonist who is able to master sort of traveling through these higher dimensions, right? In this case, she's looking for her physicist father, who is working on a tesseract space in a top secret project, right? So she's actually responding quite explicitly to C.S. Lewis, and I talk in different places about C.S. Lewis as well. So, and C.S. Lewis is another one of these guys who has, a very set of very male-centered narratives, and she loves Lewis, but she finds his views about gender and sex and marriage like hopelessly, troubling and kind of out of date. And if any of you know Lewis, I mean, he had some, I don't know what you call it, very traditional views about, very centralized views about gender and about marriage, and wanted to keep the women out of their little social club, and for sure didn't want women to be, ordained in the Anglican Church, and so she's troubled by that. And then she's troubled by the narratives, like the Narnia narratives, and the ways that they depict women and girls. So she's out to kind of revise those narratives, right? And she develops a narrative about women, powerful women, scientist women, and women who are able to kind of probe into these alternative spaces in reality. So L'Engle is one. And then a second example that I talk about in the book is W.B. Du Bois, who was a student of William James's, who was a student at Harvard, at the time when some of these dimensional ideas were just beginning to get off the ground. He reads some really seminal higher dimensional narratives. Maybe some of you have heard of like Abbott's Flatland. Edwin Abbott's 1884 classic sci-fi Flatland, which is still in print and has been continuously in print. And they've made it into a couple films. I think it's been 3 different films with different voices by like Martin Sheen and Kristen Bell. And Flatland really has this amazing cultural life in the stories I tell. So many people rewrite it, write new endings to it, make films about it, make other stories about it, make children's books about it. And then W.B. Du Bois also reads that literature, and he takes this class with James at Harvard, and we have W.B. Du Bois's notebooks from that class, and so we know that they were talking about Abbott in the class and about this other guy, Hinton, who was that mathematician I mentioned, who had this kind of cube system to try to develop a way of seeing into higher spaces. So we know that they talked about those figures, and W.B. Du Bois start to borrow these ideas in order to think about the social order in new ways and to think about race in new ways. Might it be possible to develop a higher dimensional consciousness and look down and see the world in new ways? All right. One thing that Abbott talks about, and Hinton talks about as well, is that when you're able to acquire a higher dimensional vantage point, you can see the lower dimensional world more completely. So I can explain that really quickly by talking about Abbott's Flatland, this narrative Flatland. So Flatland's about a flat 2-dimensional world. All right, it just has length and width. That's it. And so all the characters are these flat characters. They're circles and they're squares and they're triangles and they're lines, and they just slide around in that 2-dimensional world. All right, excuse me. So there's no idea that there might be a third direction in space. until a moment in the text when a three-dimensional sphere comes and hovers above the flat plane of their world and speaks to one of the main characters, who's a flat square. And this sphere says that, there's actually a third dimension to reality. And they don't believe him, and the square says, no way, this is impossible, this can't be. And the square even says, we're forbidden to talk about such things by the priests. So there's a whole kind of narrative in this Flatland story about sort of the rigidity of British norms, about thinking about unconventional things. Abbott was also critical of the rigid sort of gender notions in his society, and Flatland includes a kind of critique about gender norms. So the sphere is frustrated. The flat square says this is impossible. There's no other way to move. There's no other direction. And so the sphere, now desperate, reaches in and pulls the square out of his flat world and up into three-dimensional space. Okay, this is that higher dimensional vantage point, right, that I was talking about a second ago. So at this point, the square can look down, right, and see everything laid out in his flat three-dimensional world. All right. So when he lived within that world, when you live in a flat world, like on the surface of a table, right, and you look at the horizon, maybe you have a friend who's a circle coming towards you, right? What would you see? If you have a friend who's a triangle, who's a circle, remember you're within that flat plane, and you just have length and width. Your friend, the triangle, is coming towards you. What are you going to see? A line, exactly. So you would just see a line. So you can imagine yourself existing in that flat two-dimensional world. You would sort of see lines coming towards you. And they have houses and stuff that they'll go into. They see the line, they go around, and they would go in. But all of a sudden, when you're in three-dimensional space, what do you see? You see down on everything. Okay? And you can suddenly see inside of houses that were closed, and inside of cabinets that were closed. Right? And even inside of people. I wonder if I have an illustration of Flatland. No, I guess I don't. I just have a disembodied ghost on a television screen. I wasn't going to talk about that. Well, this actually is another example of a Flatland-like higher dimensional perspective. This is actually one person's description of their near-death experience and the ways that they go up above their house, okay, during that experience, and they're able to see down into our world, right? But they're able to see inside of everything at once. Okay? So you can see this person from this higher dimensional vantage point says that he could see into the garage. He could see into these rooms, right? When you live in a house and you're walking around like we're walking around this room, all you can see is what's in this room. But from a higher dimensional vantage point, when you go above in a higher dimension, you can see all things at once. So Du Bois liked this idea. Du Bois was interested in this idea, right? That maybe if people, as a thought experiment or a way of training the self, could acquire a kind of a higher dimensional view, they would be able to see beyond the color line, beyond the sort of ways in which our society is gridded out by race. And he writes a short story. I said it was never published. He writes a short story that's in the archive, but it's called A Vacation Unique. It's about two Harvard undergraduates, one white and one black, and they're friends, and the black undergraduate tries to convince his white friend that he should undergo a painless operation. I'm not sure what this operation would be, but a painless operation that would turn him into an African American. All right, and so he wants to convince his friend about this, and he thinks that this will allow this person to kind of acquire a new perspective on reality. So somehow or other, the narrative is kind of fragmentary, right? It's kind of a story that's not finished. But he does convince, he prevails upon his friend, he convinces him, and then they go around. The idea, for some reason, is for them to go around then, after this painless operation, and go around performing and making money for tuition, so during the summer. So this is their idea. So then, in this fragmentary narrative, they perform the operation, they do go around, performing. He doesn't say actually what they're performing and what they're doing. But lo and behold, right, this formerly white kid who is now black has all these kind of experiences of racism, right? And is now sort of able to see, the scales fall from his eyes, right, in a way, and he's able to kind of see the ways in which, our American society is structured by race, right? So Du Bois wants to think of this as kind of achieving a higher dimensional vantage point on reality, right? And he writes this narrative. He never finishes this narrative, but we do have it in the archive. He does return to these ideas, actually, and there's a terrific book about Du Bois and ideas about dimensionality called Dark Voices by Shamoun Zamir. A really interesting book. So, and Zamir makes all kinds of arguments about the influence of the higher dimensional tradition and Du Bois. And Zamir even says that that this tradition structures and influences the souls of black folk. And there's geometric language, including the color line and other kinds of geometric language in the souls of black folk. So Zamir really makes this argument that these kinds of ideas really structure Du Bois's thinking about pushing towards a kind of a new way of thinking about race, or a new set of insights about race. And Du Bois is not the only one. I talk about others who use higher dimensional ideas to think about, to think about their short stories, to think about their novels, whether they're wanting to rethink sex or gender, like L'Engle, or whether they're wanting to rethink race, like Du Bois. There's a number of people I talk about, especially figures in the early 20th century on into the mid 20th century. Robert T. Brown is one of them. Gene Toomer is another one, poet in the first couple decades of the 20th century. Many, like African American theosophists who are interested in sort of a higher dimensional consciousness or spiritual experiences, and using ideas about higher dimensions to talk about achieving this kind of higher dimensional vantage point on race. Barlow's idea. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you want to return to some of those questions. Okay, so let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts. So, my argument here is that secular scientific ideas, including especially higher dimensions, have reorganized religious perspectives. In the book, I'm particularly interested in ideas, but in general in my work, I'm not just interested in ideas. I'm interested in technologies and practices, and I think that you see new technologies that also structure or sort of reorganize the sensations of belief, right? And there's a number of cases that I want to talk about, ways in which new technologies do this. In my new work, I'm turning more and more to electronic technologies in particular. How, for example, did wireless radio, when it became popular in the 1920s, make possible new ways of experiencing religion, and even new ways of talking about religion? How about television and the internet and digital culture? How does digital culture now structure our subjectivity in certain ways? How has electronic technology indulged our fantasies of discorporation, as media scholar Jess Gauntz once said? How do technologies as extensions of our senses create new kinds of prayer that reach into new kinds of beyond spaces? How do they bring to our religious lives a new aesthetic of flow and transmissibility, especially with digital culture? How do they change the ways we think about and practice the mediation of spirit, as, for example, when we place our hands on the TV screen to feel the healing power coming from a Pentecostal preacher on TV? How do films and TV shows create a new sense of wonder or of the sublime through special effects? Something else I'm writing a little bit about. How do electronic technologies organize in new ways the sensations of belief? These are all questions that I want to continue to examine as I move into my future projects, and also continue with ideas, fantastic ideas like higher dimensions. So that was it. Maybe we can just open it up to last call. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think we should indeed open it up, and maybe you can handle the questions from there as a short distance.
Okay, first of all, was anyone able to see into higher dimensional spaces? I'm open to testimonials. Jose, you weren't even here, but you were able to see. You were able to see exactly what was happening all the time. Okay, good. So Hossein is the only one. All right. Did you say anything interesting? UFOs or aliens or?
I saw it all.
You saw it all. Okay. Okay, comments or questions? Yeah.
So you were mentioning that you're interested in more than ideas, that you're interested in practices and technologies. I was curious if you could say a bit more about practices, but what exactly do you have in mind? But the other thing, which is somewhat of a separate question I was thinking about, was you were focusing mostly on the sort of producers, the writers and so on. What do we know more about like the consumers of these ideas? Are they just sort of, I don't know, disconnected individuals reading science fiction and so on? Are there new communities created, or in what ways are they connected?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to get more into all those things, actually. Thinking about practices, thinking about behaviors, and thinking about reception. I've worked on a couple of those things. It is hard to kind of get at, like, reception of Madeline Engel's book. Although I have been to her archive, and you can read all the fan letters, which I have done. I didn't mention it, but I should have, because she is sort of this great success story. She had trouble getting it published, and now she sold over 10 million copies of just that one book. 10 million copies. I think my book is not quite up at that, not quite at that level yet. Maybe I don't know if you all run out and buy copies, I'll get there. But 10 million copies. So yeah, I try to deal a little bit with reception in that way. And then there's another terrific book that's actually on higher dimensional theories about dreaming. I have a chapter in the book about higher dimensional theories about dreaming, and also people have deja vu dreams and dreams that seem to predict the future. And there was one person who went on the BBC, J.B. Priestley is his name. Maybe some of you heard J.B. Priestley. He wrote the Time plays, Time in the Conways, plays that are still performed today. He wrote a bunch of bestsellers. He's a really important 20th century British figure. And he was very into higher dimensional theories, like the ones I've been talking about. So he's a part of my story as well. So he goes on TV, and he actually asked the BBC audience, have you had any unusual higher dimensional experiences? And if you have, can you write me letters? So, and we still have over 1,000 of those letters, which I've looked through. So there's a little bit of audience. And so there's a kind of a counter public that's created there through media, right? Television audience, radio audience. You can see a kind of a new alternative religious community or spiritual community that develops around the media. Many of these people aren't going to church, but they're kind of reading his books and they're listening to him on the BBC. So I do try to get at how people are, sort of not just writing these pieces in terms of content, but also receiving them. And then one last issue on your question about technologies. How do we think about practices and technologies? Well, I'm trying to think about ways that people, for instance, I'm writing an article right now on, do you know Reddit? The website Reddit. So I'm writing an article right now on a couple of subreddits that are called Glitch in the Matrix, which are subreddits about unusual experiences that people have. And so I'm thinking about the ways that is kind of a digital counterpublic that offers a new place to understand, talk about, and even critique unusual experiences, like seeing ghosts. A lot of it is like seeing ghosts or hearing voices. It includes a number of other ideas, but so that's a new forum for sort of discussion and understanding of these unusual experiences that doesn't take place within churches, and it also contains kind of critique of institutional religion. And also interesting for me, it uses science fictional language to talk about what's happening, right? The language from the Matrix film, right? So instead of talking about religious experiences like we used to talk about them, for instance, in the context of the church or reading the Bible and trying to understand them, people are looking to science fiction in a way and trying to think about, wow, something just happened in the Matrix, in the simulation that we're all in, right? There was a glitch and this kind of thing happened. So they include videos and they include narratives. So there's practices that take place there. I mentioned in my talk there's practices around televisions for sure. There's seances and other religious practices that take place through televisions. What does it mean to put your hand on a television, to bring it into an altar, to use it in like a religious space like that, right? And kind of feel the heat, or to even think about the ways that energies or the spirit can be transmitted through electronic technologies like radio or like television. So there's actually a lot of practices when you start thinking about technologies. It's really wide open, especially media technologies, which I've been doing quite a bit, thinking about practices related to how media technologies change practice and change belief. So there's more I could say about that, but maybe we leave it there. Yeah.
I have a question, but I also have a follow-up on Curtis's point. In thinking about the reception, I was wondering if you'd looked at any fan clubs, maybe especially fan clubs that are fan-generated as opposed to, say, publisher-generated. It might be one in. And another little bit along these lines, I was trying to get at a similar question about the reception, particularly of new cosmologies written with scientific influence, so the Brown Green influenced cosmologies and analysis.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
And I did a study where I looked at Amazon reviews, so several hundred of them, to try to figure out how people were positioning themselves related to the text. And I was surprised at how often people in their reviews described activities that they were doing with the texts. So they read it in a way that, as a scholar of religion, I could only think of as a devotional reading. So meditating over every sentence, or reading a page a day, or particularly if it was a text about nature, taking it outside, and that enhanced the experience. And there were a realm of others. But I would imagine, especially for a text like A Wrinkle in Time, there are going to be enough reviews that you get a significant body of material.
That's a great idea. I'd like to read your stuff, actually. Maybe I can get your contact information. That's a great idea. I didn't, the only Wrinkle in Time stuff I did was, when I wrote about Wrinkle in Time, a lot of what I did was sort of thinking about how she mobilized those kind of scientific ideas to develop a worldview, and also her stuff on gender. It was really kind of about like her. But the reception stuff would be great. I mean, it's such a big and important, book. And I did look through fan stuff, but I, to be honest, I kind of felt like I didn't know what to do with it all. It was like boxes of this stuff. But it sounds like you were able to kind of develop a framework.
A little one.
With the J.B. Priestley stuff, I was able to use some of that. And that was fascinating because it was very confessional. I mean, people were like, I had these experiences, and I feel like I'm crazy. And there were all kinds of different experiences in there. But I would like to get more out of that. That would be great,
First, thank you. You've blown my mind, and you saved me a lot of money on drugs. This is fantastic.
That's right, yes, that's right.
I want to ask about two aspects of your talk. One, and actually my two questions or points or areas of kind of doubt might seem to be contradictory. It's just another testament to the power of your explanation. But I want to ask you about the distinction you make between secular science and theology. You make it repeatedly, and even in your last sentence, secular science has reorganized theological perspectives. And I wanted to ask you, in a way, I mean, you're scientizing the category of theology, but you could just have easily have theologized the category of science, since the kind of Pythagoreanism that has underwritten much of the power of the interaction between mathematics and religion, I'll call it religion, I know it's an anachronistic word, has certainly existed since Pythagoras to the present, and there really is no moment of great scientific discovery that hasn't been saturated with theology. So even the discovery of quantum mechanics was steeped in the language of causal determinism, free will, and similarly, if you think about the many worlds hypothesis, why do we think that the collapse of the wave function has got to have a real? This was also a theologically and both motivated and theologically resisted, in the sense that scientists who resisted it said, no, that's theological mumbo jumbo. So what I'm trying to say is that they've always been kind of interpenetrated. In that sense, what would be gained by putting them more in dynamic interaction with each other, rather than saying secular science, theology? And then the other question might seem to be cross-cutting, but fantastic science as opposed to non-fantastic science, and you want to give it an explanatory value, and you want to say, well, as science seems more and more fantastic, well then why can't my heaven right? And I guess I would almost ask, why don't we do it the other way around? Why don't we say it's precisely what Eugene Wigner, the 1963 Physics Nobel Prize, said, it's the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, of the creation of the human mind, to then find confirmation in the natural world that gives it the power to make claims which, and so in that sense, all of these, the most basic kind of mathematization, the form, precisely its formal nature, is what it keeps any of it from actually being fantastic. It's all based on this fantasy of the power of number. So in that sense, there isn't really, fantastic versus unfantastic, and it's really because of the power, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics that either Plato and the Timaeus or people playing with the many worlds hypothesis can say this makes sense. So it's not it's not because science is seeming more fantastic and less reliable. It's not false science kind of or false news kind of mentality. It's actually a continuation of the power of number. How about? I mean, I just wondered.
No, I love all of it. That's great. I mean, I 100% agree with everything you're saying. I mean, it reminds me of what I've been telling my students, because I teach these classes on controversies in science and religion, and everyone comes to class saying, science and religion conflict, and they're separate, and here's the science people, here's the religion people. But what I'm constantly saying to them is, no, actually, it's actually, by the time you get to the class, it's like it's all part of culture, and you can't make these kind of distinctions. So, but on the issue of talking about secular scientists versus other kinds of people, I wrestle with that a lot in my writing, and what I try to do is I try to think about how do the people I'm studying construct these categories and use these categories, right? And they're arguing, so you have scientists who are rejecting out of hand all of this stuff, and I'm trying to figure out what to call them as I narrate their stories, right? And they have various strategies, right, for doing this. I mean, they have various reasons to rule out things that they call metaphysics or speculation or the unempirical, but as I sort of indicated in my comments today, I'm suspicious, like you are, that there's such a thing as a pure kind of science that is separate from your questions and your concerns and your theological problems. And so in the book, I do try, there is a group of scientists who do say things like, this is a ridiculous and illegitimate misuse of the kinds of things that we're talking about. And then you have some scientists who say, no, I'm perfectly comfortable actually engaging in this speculation, right? And then you have other kinds of people in pop culture who also engage in this kind of speculation. So I wrestle with what to call some of these people. Is it secular? Is it spiritual? Right? Is it religion? How do we talk about that? But I totally agree that it's a very messy landscape of things that's going on. And many of the people, as I tried to say, many of the people who would consider themselves agnostic or even anti-religious often are bringing something that we might call wonder or awe or spirituality in through the back door. So I remember listening to Brian Greene interviewing Richard Dawkins. I don't know if you've seen it. It's great. It's great. You should Google it. It's on YouTube. Yeah. But Brian Greene is talking about, he's like, I'm not religious. I was raised Jewish. I don't believe in that. But then he can't stop talking about how, there's the universe is kind of amazing and wonderful, creation. And Dawkins was criticizing because you're being too religious, and Greene was like, look, it doesn't bother me. Maybe there is a God. I don't know, which kind of scandalized, Richard Dawkins. But he's like, maybe there is, but why are you so dogmatic about it? He's kind of arguing with Richard Dawkins about it. So maybe there is a creator. Maybe there is this kind of intelligence that shaped everything. And so. Yeah, I wrestle with what to call these people and how I narrate this, but in my mind, it is all smashed together. Now, when I present this kind of stuff to, let's say, a University of Chicago or a Vassar College chemist, or someone in a bio lab, they say, what are you talking about? So I think when we talk about the ways in which science and religion come together, I'm often talking about physics and cosmology, which is specific, or we can talk about math. You mentioned Pythagoras and Plato, and there is a kind of a mysticism to that. But I think people who work in labs and do chemistry or do biology or do other things are like, what are you talking about? There's no mysticism or spirituality to my work. So it kind of depends on the science that I think that you're talking about. And so I'm not sure that, the folks working in a bio lab would say that they're working on fantastic science. So maybe this gets to your second comment. These kind of fantastic science that I see in 20th century cosmology, they are kind of things that seem impossible, even to the scientists themselves. It seems likely that they're true, like quantum entanglement, There's no explanation for that, but we know it happens. So that's fantastic in the sense scientists don't know. They know it's true, but they don't know why. And there's no one who has an idea for how it could possibly even happen. So that's kind of fantastic, and that's, I think, where some other kinds of people enter in and say, well, look, if you believe in this kind of stuff and you don't have an explanation, who are you to tell me that I can't believe in a heavenly space? So I think and again, some scientists don't like that, but we've got a couple hands. But
yeah, this may be related. Trying to get the distinction, if there is one, between higher dimension and supernatural.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that the higher dimension language assumes the uniformity of mathematics to apply to all things. And I'm not sure that the notion of the supernatural always does.
So are you saying that the higher dimensional math is sort of still a closed universe and the supernatural is still open?
As it's used to speak about various religions, I'm not sure that the notion of uniformity through all conceivable spaces and times is meant by supernatural. So it's just a clarification of concepts. And then second, if I have to ask a second point, the voice thing is very interesting because there the higher dimension doesn't have to do with spatiality, but rather with value distinctions.
Yeah.
And is that found in some of this higher dimensional visions?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So your first question, it gets to the kind of the ambiguity or the tension that I'm trying to exploit really in the book, which is what is this invisible direction? And some mathematicians or scientists would say that, well, this is a direction that might exist. If it does, it's a part of the physical universe, and it is all uniform, right? It may be a part of the universe that we can't see or perceive. Nevertheless, you do have, maybe there's something irresistible about mathematically pointing the way to an invisible space. Something irresistible because you do have mathematicians and scientists who then say, well, I wonder if the universe is bigger than we can perceive and see. I wonder if maybe there's not just these extra physical spaces, but maybe there's a spiritual space. So there's kind of an imaginative jump that some people are willing to make.
I understand that, but would that make it supernatural? Or does the idea of continuity ingredient to the notion of nature? This was, I think, part of the tool.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, it kind of, you could look at a heavenly space as part of the natural world.
Yes,
if you want.
exactly.
So you could have a cosmology like the Mormons, right? Where heaven's like another planet or something. So right, then it might be better to not call that supernatural.
Right, exactly.
But I think there's a lot of slippage in how people understand what that. And I try to work my way through that slippage and try to figure out exactly how people are talking about that. Is it merely natural? And even if it's merely natural, if it's still, if it's merely natural though, how can you go there as a heavenly space after your body's dead? Is there something else called a soul that's also natural and then travels somehow to another natural space? So to me, it seems like it must, if you're talking about heavenly, it must be spiritual or supernatural in some sense. I don't know. Right?
Maybe the qualification merely is the problem.
Yeah. Well, and maybe it has to do with how we understand what's included in the natural. Right. So what was your second question, though, about the moral quality of higher dimensions?
I found that fascinating that your previous example was perceptions of spaces.
Yeah.
And Boyce is using it for the perception of moral differerentiations.
That is actually built into the higher dimensional thinking all the way back to, I mentioned Abbott, and I mentioned Hinton. So Abbott has this narrative flatland, and in the narrative, he talks about this kind of higher dimensional perception that the flat square has, and he uses it to develop a more complete picture of the social order. So this square can now see everything, and he discovers moral and ethical things too.
Oh.
So he discovers that the way that the society treats women is really weird and wrong, for instance. And then Hinton's another one. Hinton was a mathematician with the Rubik's Cube thing. Hinton also has this idea that, well, when we move up to a higher level, something else that you see is that although in this realm we all look like separate beings, in the higher level we're all connected. And he talked about like a hand. You know, if you take your hand and you have a flat two-dimensional world and you put it into the two-dimensional world, you know, what would the flatlanders see when I put my hand in the world? They would see like 5 separate little circles. But at a higher dimensional level, if you're able to see the whole thing, it's one thing. So Hinton talks like that and develops a whole new ethic about sort of socialism, and even things like rethinking gender and marriage. He actually had 2 wives. His father was a big, proponent of like redoing marriage and stuff. I mean, yeah. So it has a social dimension all the way through, actually. And other reformers use it to talk about reform, other kinds of reforms. Yeah.
So thank you very much for this. I want to ask you about the notion of transcending the self.
Yeah.
In relation to the religious examples, or what you're identifying as religious examples and scientific examples, and the use of technology. Like, I'm reminded of something like the development of optical lenses, right? And the possibility of seeing things that you've never seen before, right? And the way that this actually developed, especially in art, before it was incorporated into biological science. And I wonder if your example about different kinds of sciences maybe responding differently to this question of whether something is mystical or beyond, might relate to this, or that we might find commonality in the notion of transcending the self. So, in your example of Flatman, like, that seems to be what you're describing spatially, right? And in your example of the boys, you also seem to be describing a kind of transcendence of the perspective of the white figure who becomes black.
Yeah.
Right? And so I guess I'm wondering if you see this as consistent with maybe earlier notions, religious notions of transcending the self, or do you see it working differently in the context of technology and the way that we're seeing these examples?
Yeah.
Is there a commonality there, or is it really different?
I think there is a commonality and maybe a common trajectory, and I think you can see it as a kind of a new, quote-unquote, more scientific language for an experience that we used to call transcendence or something, or religious experience or inspiration or something like that. So I think that there is a commonality there. On your question about technology, you talked about technologically mediated visions of the beyond, which is called that. So, and I think we could talk about that. I mean, I think that when people achieve this higher dimensional vantage point, they definitely transcend the self and they transcend their world. I think, to me, it's a little bit separate to talk about, to switch gears a little bit, to talk about technology as a tool that allows you to see into a beyond. And so you can think about a telescope. It's a technology that allows you to see into beyond. Or a television. It's a technology that allows you to see things you can't see with your unaided eye. So, or you could think about flight. I'm actually working on a conference paper that I'm giving. I just gave it. I gave it in New York City a few days ago. I've been traveling a lot. So, early flight. So, the airplane is a technology that allows people to go up, just like in Abbott's Flatland, go up above the surface of the earth. And all these early aviators talk about the experience in religious terms. It's amazing. There's a whole mysticism of this kind of flight. Another technology that allows them to transcend themselves. But with all those technological examples, so the space program, right? The 12 men that went to the moon, many of them had these kind of mystical experiences of transcendence. And so, but I wonder if the language would be a little bit different there. And there I might want to bring in, like Philip Fisher's book on wonder, and thinking about like this experience of wonder and the sublime, as maybe a slightly different. But then we just make distinctions maybe between different forms of religious experience, right? Maybe standing in front of the Grand Canyon or looking down from a plane or looking through a telescope or looking at your TV and seeing the beyond is like aesthetically and emotionally different from hearing a voice. So maybe we want to, get into thinking about like how we talk about different kinds of unusual experiences. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I mean,
I guess I'm also thinking about like the way that the sublime might be realized in art, right? So Dutch masters use these lenses in order to produce portraiture that is, so exact, so evocative that the experience of that art is somehow this sort of experience of the sublime. But it's really done on the basis of this technology that allows the artist to see better than they ever saw before.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. I do have a chapter in the book on the American cubist Max Weber. And I have another chapter that deals with an American architect. But they both are interested in using higher dimensional ideas to rethink painting. So it's really interesting, right? Because they then think about higher dimensional vantage points and bringing them to a painting, right? And is there a way that we can break, like a higher dimensional vantage point would sort of break down our way of seeing things, and like Max Weber and other cubists use this idea to kind of break down the outer world of forms, and they thought of what they were doing as painting something more essential, like getting to the absolute, So he has an interesting story where he's actually raised Jewish, and then he develops this, he's like the first American cubist, and he develops this cubism to see into the absolute. And then he later in life recovers his Judaism and combines like his cubism with his Judaism to sort of see transcendently. So maybe another case of using the technology to think about transcendence. Yeah.
So thank you. Lots to think about. I have a question about a skeptical question. That I think may be posed to some of the ideas you're tracking. And my question is whether the skepticism seems fair, right? So the skepticism is, I think, from a sort of a standard philosophical challenge to references to either religion or the supernatural or the fantastic to explain what we can't explain. Okay, it's the God of the gaps. Okay. And so, is it fair to say that much of what you're tracking is vulnerable to that challenge?
To the God of the gaps argument,
right?
Or
because it just struck me as superficially that it might be, but that's why I say I'm not sure. And so I'm wondering what your view is, and if it is a fair challenge, what do you have to say about it? I'm just curious.
I think it is. I mean, in some ways, I think fantastic science is a science of the gaps in some ways, Things that are unbelievable that seem impossible. So there is a gap in scientific knowledge. So I think it would be vulnerable to that criticism for sure. I mean, you could have, thinking of like relativity too, right? Where relativity says things that seem fantastic. So I would say yes. Some of the higher dimensional thinking is a God of the gaps type of thinking, where you have a new space to put the supernatural in. So others might be a little bit different, in the sense that like when relativity becomes important in pop culture, of course people have their own ways of understanding what relativity means. But in pop culture, one thing that relativity means to people is that there's no absolute frame of reference. So that places the subjective observer in a new position vis-a-vis reality. So the role of the subjective observer becomes really important, the role of experience in the mind becomes really, really important, and the role of consciousness becomes important. And then that continues through quantum mechanics and the ways that people appropriate that, and the role of consciousness and collapsing the wave function and other things that are happening in quantum mechanics. So in that case, if we follow those uncanny ideas or those fantastic scientific ideas, I'm not sure that those are about gaps. They're still fantastic in a way because they place the observer and the observing consciousness in an unexpected role, vis-a-vis the natural world. but for some anyway, they empower the consciousness. So that gave people, including some astrophysicists, this idea that the experiencing self, the conscious self, was actually had a kind of an important spark, an important centrality. And that might be a case where you have a fantastic idea that is not gap-oriented. But much of higher dimensions in some ways are by their nature kind of a gap, like an unexpected place that we can't understand or see.
I mean, I guess the thought is that on the second view, it's the fantastic or the higher dimensions are all contingent on the state of knowledge in the present, right? And so
it's going to knowledge catches up.
Right. It's going. That's why I said exactly.
Yeah.
I just wonder if in all of the material you're looking at, those are anxieties that find some kind of register or voice.
Not so much in the subjects that I study, but in the science and religion dialogue that we have around today, there is certainly that conversation about, well, you're just exploring gaps that are not yet discovered by science. So I think it remains vulnerable to that kind of critique for sure.
Thank you.
Can I ask a different question? I don't know if you ever read any works by Peter Harrison, who's written on science and religion.
Yeah.
And so he kind of has this argument that I quite like, that in the 17th century Britain, he's mostly talking about, scientists would actually appeal to theologians to adjudicate problems, but in the process, because these theologians weren't capable of doing so, the power dimension sort of flipped and science became the adjudicator, right? Yeah. And I think this whole story, also in the 19th century, 20th century, is an ascendancy of the position of science. Yeah. But it's interesting to contemplate in the current political climate, with environmental science not being taken seriously, whether that could flip back in a way. I mean, is there a way that science, in a way, loses its authority and would therefore lose its power to convey religious meaning? Or would project a different religious meaning. I mean, not the sublime, but the apocalyptic or whatever.
Absolutely. No, I think that's right. I think there is a narrative there. I mean, when you look at the period, 1880 to 60, it really is a period of scientific positivism, this kind of great faith that science will probe all of the unexplored gaps, and it will master everything, including all problems that are human and social, and so there is a kind of ascendant narrative of science becoming the authoritative discourse, and I think that has happened. But I do think that since the 60s and sort of postmodern suspicion of grand narratives, and look, if you look at American polling now, there's a lot of suspicion about science now. Yeah. So there may be a way in which this is kind of shifting in the way that you're pointing to. And there may be a way in which people are saying things like, science has been doing bad things. Science is producing pollution and environmental collapse, and nuclear weapons and modern warfare and disease. And so, I think there is maybe a cresting wave of skepticism about science that may open the door for, I don't know, maybe these kind of conversations or maybe this kind of conversation. I mean, maybe in a way that's what's making, it's kind of, it's making possible some of the people that I talk about, right? I mean, you have these new age physicists and others who really do have an audience, and it doesn't really matter to a lot of these people that, Richard Dawkins is calling them, simpletons and country bumpkins and, and old-timey religious believers. People it doesn't really matter to them. They don't really believe Richard Dawkins. So I think the faith in science has eroded, and maybe it does open up space for ethicists and philosophers and theologians and in this kind of back and forth conversation. Yeah.
Simple question. Have there been signs of receptivity among the nuns to this sort of religion?
Catholic nuns? Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I feel like these are the kinds of people I ended up talking about in the book and in my research a lot. Sort of like Madeline Engel, people who say they have no religion or sort of have moved away from their childhood religion and are piecing together a new imaginative worldview that includes these kinds of fantastic elements. So absolutely, I see that community of nuns and maybe the spiritual but not religious as kind of the people actually who are invested in this. I mean, you do have many others, I think, who are interested in reading popular science and are excited by popular science documentary, Jews and Christians and Muslims and others. And I have some of those folks in the book as well. Like, C.S. Lewis is in there, and Max Weber, who I mentioned, was Jewish. But yeah, I see a lot of receptivity among nuns who are sort of piecing together a new enchanted kind of worldview by using this material.
And with regard to the question about skepticism, it is interesting though, especially I was just reading about this last night, the guys who traveled to the moon and have been in the shuttle.
Yeah.
Looking down on Earth.
Yeah.
And just this overpowering sense of awe.
Yeah.
And mystery. But there's nothing there. There's nothing tangible except this mystery.
Yeah.
This sense of, oh, this is bigger than I had expected.
Yeah.
Which is interesting in that it seems to be, in some sense, different from God.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think this is where we get to trying to think about different types of religious experiences or experiences we call religious or experiences we might call spiritual and what they might be. And that's a big case of the technology space shuttle, right, that allows people to have a new angle of vision on things. They get to the moon, they look back, and there's this tiny blue marble, this brilliant blue marble in the middle of like this inky black space. And they have these kinds of experiences you're talking about. This is not really a God of the gaps experience, right? So there's nothing, it's not like there's something missing there, but what is it? I mean, I think there it might be this kind of experience of wonder or the sublime where you're confronted with it's often visual too, when people talk about wonder or the sublime, these experiences. You're confronted with a visual experience that is unexpected and is new, and it raises a level of wonder and astonishment and surprise and curiosity. And I don't know, I think that vision too is puts your world in a context that's kind of hard to believe too. That and maybe there's a question of scale that's a part of that experience, right? Because there's a difference in scale all of a sudden you've never experienced. Seeing the Earth as being that small. Neil Armstrong told a story about how he was up on the moon and then he saw the Earth as just like this amazing, brilliant, blue, bright, that's small, and there's just nothing else, that's alive out there. And he talks about how he put up his thumb and he was able to cover the whole Earth, everything that we all know, every source of all of our life. And someone said to him, well, that must have made you feel really big. And he said, no, I felt really small. I'm kind of interested in that too as a part of this experience of scale, and wonder, right? That you're just confronted with your smallness, maybe in a way that you are at the Grand Canyon or something as well. But I think we get into thinking about experience and religious experience and what different types. But yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good moment to end the conversation. And thank you for a wonderful lecture and stimulating discussion.
Thanks very much.